In the name of the God of creation who loves us all, amen. Please be seated. Good morning and welcome to the cathedral on this day when we give thanks for all of creation, following the lesson of St. Francis. For sea monsters and all deeps, fire and hail, snow and fog, mountains and all hills, fruit trees and cedars, wild beasts, creeping things and winged birds. Yes, we're called to praise and give thanks to God for all who live on this fragile earth, our island home. In today's gospel from Matthew, we're reminded that some forms of wisdom cannot be obtained by working harder and harder for them. Even those forms of wisdom that ostensibly would lead us to become wiser and more intelligent. Knowledge of God, or come to that of ourselves, it seems, cannot always be obtained through the means of effort or dint of perseverance, as we typically understand both of these. Now, I don't know about you all, but this perspective turns my ways of being and doing in the world upside down. Jesus has a way of doing this, of course, but it still catches me off guard whenever I hear this passage. What might it mean if through my often type A behavior I am missing the point, maybe even missing the purpose of what our lives as Christians are to be about? Can I really reconcile this part of me with the need to become, well, more childlike in my faith? And then in verses 28 through 30, we find this simply lovely invitation to which these passages have been building. Come to me, all who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Begging the question, of course, what heavy burdens are we carrying, and how might we ask God to lighten them? What might this have to do with becoming more childlike, as Matthew seems to imply? For Francis, the burden was to be found in his own narrative origins, in his own life story. You all know the story. He was born the son of a wealthy cloth merchant. His early years, we are told, were frivolous, but an experience of sickness and another of military service were instrumental in leading him to think more deeply about the purpose of his life. He tells us that he was lost and he needed to find new points on the compass. One day in the church of San Damiano, he heard Christ saying to him, "Francis, repair my falling house." He took the words literally, sold a bale of silk from his father's warehouse to pay for repairs to the church. He renounced all of his material possessions and devoted himself to serving the poor. And the rest, as they say, is history. Well, Francis taught us to pay attention to the natural world and to learn what it might have to teach us, including all of God's creatures. Like John Muir, whom I have come to think of as a latter-day Francis, who also heard the siren song of nature and simplicity, he invites us into the mystery of journeys perhaps more childlike in nature, yokes perhaps less burdensome, wisdom hidden from those of us who perhaps place too much emphasis on certain kinds of intelligence, to quote the gospel for this morning. In Celtic spirituality, for example, animals are often symbolic of deeper spiritual lives. The wild goose is thought to be symbolic of the Holy Spirit. Francis was a great observer of nature, and this led me to recall a trip that I took not too long ago. I was eager to get a new sea kayak on the water, and I knew just the place for its maiden voyage. And along with a friend, I headed to Lake Jocassee, which is tucked into upstate South Carolina, where it intersects with North Carolina and Georgia. If you blow by on I-85, you're likely to miss it. We put our boats in the water, and approaching the dramatic escarpment of the Blue Ridge, we made our way northwest across the wide open expanse of the lake. A light March wind and bright sun greeted us in this transitional space between the Carolina Piedmont and the mountains. Paddling steadily through the morning, we headed to the Horse Pasture River, one of 4 rivers that feed Lake Jocassee. And gradually the open water gave way to the crenellated canyons of the 4 rivers area, and soon we found ourselves in the narrowing river gorge. Mountains rose on either side, forests of hemlocks and pines sheltered us, waterfalls emptied into the lake full from spring rains. As the river canyon narrowed, I saw just ahead of my boat a pair of large birds, black and white, swimming ahead, diving underwater, bobbing up yards ahead. They dove underwater only to reappear upstream. They were mysterious and lovely birds, and I couldn't quite place them in my categories of local residents, which I thought I knew well. They must be loons, I thought, my racing heart recalling canoe trips to Minnesota's boundary waters with friends during graduate school, but my head disagreed, reason prevailed. Loons would not be in upstate South Carolina in March, so far from Minnesota and Canada. I did not trust my own voice, my own heart. And still these birds seemed to be leading me upriver until they disappeared. Well, our sojourn ended at the Foothills Trail Bridge across the Horse Pasture River. It's such lovely country, and I commend it to you. We could go no further in our boats. And the river upstream was now a roaring whitewater torrent at the end of its 2,000-foot plunge into Lake Jocassee. We ate lunch on the bridge as mist from the waterfall surrounded and enveloped us in cool, ethereal embrace. In this deep river gorge, sunlight was scarce, and I realized it was getting colder. Clouds were moving in. Shivering and cold, we climbed back into our boats for the long trip back, and I glanced at the lovely high waterfalls behind us, one last view. I found myself feeling disoriented and momentarily anxious. The country we were in was so different from the calm and sunny lake on which we began. And what were those birds? Their mystery seemed to add to my momentary disorientation. Even as I felt more alive, I was more vigilant. We were on a journey perhaps less Odyssean than Abrahamic. I realized we would probably not go home by the way we came. Soon it began to rain, and I paddled steadily across the water and came to a fork in the river, uncertain which direction to take. My colleague, a more efficient and stronger paddler, and in possession of the GPS and the map somewhere up ahead in the rain and the fog. And suddenly, the birds were swimming again in front of my boat. They dove underwater, reappeared downriver, and took the right fork. I did too, calmed by their presence. Hours later, we reached the put-in, wet, weary, and enlivened by the journey, and that night, back home, warm and dry, I pulled up the Department of Natural Resources website for the Jocassee Gorges area. I clicked on the link that read wildlife and read this: the common loon is now an occasional winter resident at Jocassee. They return north to their summer breeding grounds in April, and for reasons we cannot fully understand, their numbers seem to be growing. So you see, my sisters and brothers, my heart had known what my head would not allow. In my weariness and fear, I had forgotten to listen to that, childlike wisdom, to pay attention to the small, still voice that Francis encouraged us to hear over and over again. The psychologist Carl Jung once said, "The soul rejoices in hearing spoken out loud what it has known to be true all along." And indeed, that is true. And this is why hearing into speech is such sacred work. And so on this feast day of St. Francis, my friends, we're called to ask, who am I? Where am I going? How am I being transformed? And to what am I paying attention? Out there and in here. More and more often when I think about and perhaps ask these questions of myself, I remember that trip on Lake Jocassee. If St. Francis is correct in calling us to attend to our heart, to have courage, and the word's origins are the same for both, by allowing ourselves to be more vulnerable and to learn from that place where we seek a load less wearisome, a lighter burden, a more childlike simplicity. I look back on this trip as a lesson in wholehearted living. If we're creatures of mind and body and spirit, what does wholeness look like? How do we know? Each has its place. But perhaps in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is telling us that it is finally in listening to the motions of the heart that we find wholeness. My journey into the mystery of Lake Jocassee, a kind of metaphor really for my own soul, has helped me a little bit with that journey. Wendell Berry has said, it may be that we no longer know what to do. We've come to our real work. When we no longer know which way to go, we have begun our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. I think we're called to be unafraid even in the face of the new thing that we do not quite perceive, that will draw us from the security of the familiar. Because God has given us the Holy Spirit, maybe in the form of a wild goose, maybe in the form of a pair of loons, guiding us and working as our advocate. This is the journey of the Paschal mystery. It is the hope of an easier yoke. Come to me, all you that are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And so upon returning from my Jocassee sojourn, I resumed teaching and counseling and the other tasks of my priesthood. But I sought to listen a bit more, to talk a bit less, to pay attention. Francis, dear ones, calls each of us to attend to the movable feast of God's Spirit in all the forms that it may take. Just ahead, upriver, it guides and invites us to listen to the stirrings of our soul, to pay attention to our heart, for such is God's gracious will. And so thank you, Francis, who reminds us to give thanks and praise to God through Sister Moon and stars, brothers wind and air, Sister water, brother fire, and Mother Earth, who sustains us all. Amen.